The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the weather or the smell of my husband's freshly brewed coffee. It was the sound of a saw whining from the other side of the fence. Sharp, insistent, and unfamiliar. A sound that didn't belong to our quiet cul-de-sac where routine lived and change died slowly, like frost on a windshield. I peered through the kitchen window, half hidden behind the lace curtain, and there he was, the returning neighbor. Shirt off, skin weathered and tight against wiry muscle, bent over a plank of cedar like it owed him something. He was at least 20 years older than me, maybe more. Gray at the temples, broad shoulders, hands that looked capable of building or destroying with equal care. I should have looked away. Instead, I lingered. I told myself it was curiosity, that I was just watching the renovation of a garden shed, not the arc of a stranger's back. But something in the pit of my stomach shifted when his head turned slightly, as if he knew I was watching. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He just wiped his forehead with the back of his hand and kept working. That silence unsettled me more than a greeting ever could. Later, over lunch, my husband asked if I wanted anything from the store. "They've got those teas you like back in stock," he added, eyes still on his phone. I nodded, murmured something about chamomile, and watched him walk out the door. He was a good man. A safe man. But lately, even his kindness had started to feel procedural, like a scheduled maintenance check, polite, reliable, predictable. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did. But love without touch begins to feel like memory foam, soft, compliant, and entirely forgettable. We hadn't made love in 5 months. Not out of spite, not because of any fight, but because neither of us had initiated it. When I brought it up once in passing, he smiled, kissed my forehead, and said, "We're just busy." That answer stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. That afternoon, I found myself in front of my closet, fingers grazing hangers not for practical clothes, but for something delicate, something soft and sensuous that I hadn't worn in ages. I picked a simple dress, light, clinging just enough. Underneath, a pair of silk underwear I'd almost forgotten I owned, not because I had anywhere to go, but because it made me feel like I had somewhere to be. I went out to water the plants, by the side fence. The soil was dry, cracked in spots. I bent down, adjusted the hose nozzle, and heard footsteps on the gravel behind the fence. Not hurried, not hesitant, just there, present, like the wind shifting direction before you feel it. Then his voice, low even, edged with age but calm. "You've got some stubborn weeds along the back. I could pull them for you if you like." I didn't turn around, not immediately. "I don't mind them. They know when to stop growing," he chuckled. "I suppose we all do, eventually." I finally faced him. He was leaning on the fence with one arm, sun catching the lines on his face like a topographic map of every year he'd lived. His eyes weren't flirtatious. They were observant, and that made them far more dangerous. "I'm just settling in again," he said. "It's quieter than I remembered." "Quiet can be loud," I replied. He studied me for a second longer, then nodded, almost like a bow, and walked off toward his shed. I stood there long after the water had soaked the ground, long after the heat had left my skin. That night, my husband brought home the wrong tea. I didn't mention it. I laid awake, beside him, staring at the ceiling fan, each rotation slower than the last. The sheets felt cold no matter how close I pulled them. I closed my eyes and saw the curve of a man's back, the twitch of his fingers as they gripped wood, the shape of a gaze that didn't ask for anything, but didn't look away either. Should have forgotten it by morning. But instead, I woke up earlier than usual, opened the window to the same angle, and waited for the sound of a saw. It didn't come, just the sound of birds and the feel of silk against my skin. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't dared to name before. I didn't want to be lonely in my own body anymore. Not again. I didn't plan anything that day. At least that's what I kept telling myself. There wasn't a script, no secret note left on a napkin, no suggestive glance across a fence. Just a quiet craving, buried under the familiar weight of routines. But cravings have their own language. They move your hands before your mind catches up. By mid-morning, I had chosen a different dress. Not a special one, at least not on the surface. It was casual enough to pass for comfort, but light enough that the breeze could trace the outline of my hips. Underneath, a pair of white lace briefs I'd never worn outside the house. Too impractical, I used to think. Too delicate for errands, chores, life. But that morning, life was the last thing I wanted to feel bound to. I stepped out with a watering can even though it had rained the night before. My shoes were off. The lawn was still damp, the grass leaving little kisses of cold against my feet. I walked toward the side yard like I'd forgotten something there, pausing near the azaleas. They weren't in bloom. But I knelt beside them anyway, one hand buried in the soft soil, the other resting on my thigh. The kind of posture that looks unconscious until you realize exactly how long you've held it. He was already in his yard. I knew before I saw him. It was the sound again, not of tools this time, but of movement. Deliberate. The creak of wood under a shifting body. I didn't lift my head immediately. Let him look, if he was looking. Let him wonder if I knew. When? I finally glanced up. He was standing not 10 feet away, coiling an extension cord. His sleeves were rolled up, forearms streaked with old paint, veins like raised lines on a map. I caught his eyes just as he looked up, and for a second, we just stood there, two strangers separated by more than just a fence. Then, like a man, remembering his manners, he raised a hand. "Morning," he said. I nodded. "You're up early." "Old habits," he said. "The kind that don't leave you, no matter who does." I didn't ask what he meant. I wasn't ready to know. A pause settled between us, not uncomfortable but charged. He reached down and picked up a clay pot that had cracked down the side, held it up like a question. "You ever fix these?" "Sometimes," I said. "But usually they end up thrown away." He smiled, but there was no amusement in it. "Some things aren't meant to be repaired." His gaze lingered a moment too long before he disappeared behind the gate to his backyard. I thought that would be it. Another moment suspended in ambiguity. Another itch without a scratch. I was wrong. Later that afternoon, as I stepped outside again, this time without the watering can, I found him crouched near the shared edge of our properties, pulling weeds that didn't belong to him. "You don't have to do that," I said. He didn't look up. "I don't mind." I moved closer, close enough to see the sweat along the back of his neck. Close enough to smell the varnish still clinging to his skin. "You're working too hard," I said. He stood. We were face to face now. Close enough to make distance feel theatrical. His eyes scanned my face slowly, then drifted down, not inappropriately, but intentionally. And when they returned to mine, something passed between us. Not lust, not romance. Something older, heavier, recognition. "You're not wearing shoes," he said quietly. I looked down at my feet, then back at him. I forgot. He tilted his head like that answer was enough. Maybe it was. I should have left then. I should have nodded, smiled, stepped back into the safety of my own house with its neutral tones and tidy hallways. But instead, I shifted my weight, took a small step forward, not even a full step, more like a breath, and he mirrored me, just enough to erase the air between us. And then it happened. He didn't ask. I didn't hesitate. There were no preambles, no whispered warnings, just the press of his mouth against mine, rough, warm, startling in its simplicity. His hand grazed my arm, slid to the curve of my waist like he wasn't asking permission, just remembering a shape. I leaned into him because I wanted to. Because for the first time in months, someone was touching me like I existed. It wasn't long, a few seconds, maybe 10. But in that moment, time folded in on itself. I wasn't a wife. I wasn't a neighbor. I wasn't a woman who alphabetized spices or changed sheets on Thursdays. I was just skin, just heat, just need. Then I stepped back. Not because I regretted it, but because I knew I would come back if I stayed. He didn't say a word. He watched me walk away, eyes steady, unashamed. Inside, I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers at my lips. I could still feel the shape of him there. My breath caught in my chest, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. I wasn't done, and neither was he. It was only the next morning, but everything already felt altered, like the air had thickened, like objects around the house had shifted half a degree without my noticing. I moved through my routines the way someone walks through a room filled with smoke, carefully, silently, avoiding any sudden gestures that might stir something dangerous from its hiding place. My husband was in an unusually good mood. He made coffee and even buttered my toast, humming some half-remembered tune as if we were in the opening scene of a cheerful movie neither of us would ever sit through. He kissed me on the temple and said, "I have a surprise for you later." I smiled and nodded and swallowed dry toast that tasted like cardboard. I didn't ask what the surprise was. I couldn't. I was still living in the ghost of a kiss I hadn't confessed, a kiss that still pressed against my skin like a fever that wouldn't break. Later that day, he revealed it, a weekend away, just the two of us. "Like old times," he said, eyes bright with intention. "A bed and breakfast in the mountains, that place we loved near the falls. I already booked the room." It was the kind of gesture I'd once longed for. Years ago, I might have cried from happiness, but now the words fell flat, their echo landing somewhere deep and disoriented inside me. All I could manage was, "That's thoughtful." He didn't notice the pause. Or if he did, he pretended not to. We left the following Friday, driving north in the late afternoon, our bags tucked neatly in the trunk, a playlist from our 20s murmuring through the speakers. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by trees that blurred into green tunnels of memory. I stared out the window, tracing clouds with my eyes, and tried to feel something other than anticipation for a man who wasn't in the car with me. He talked about work, about some client situation that had resolved itself finally, and I nodded in the right places. My responses were automatic, reflexes, not feelings. At one point, he reached for my hand across the console. His fingers were warm, steady. I let him hold mine, but there was a hollowness to the contact, like his skin passed through mine without leaving a mark. It was the kind of touch that should have comforted me, but instead only reminded me of all the touches I'd stopped noticing years ago. We arrived at the inn just before sunset. The same yellow paint, the same ivy on the trellis, the same smell of lavender drifting from the porch. It should have felt nostalgic. Instead, it felt staged, like we were both playing characters we'd lost the script for. Our names were on the reservation. The key had a wooden tag carved into the shape of a heart. In the room, everything was too quiet. He sat on the bed and asked, "Do you remember this place?" I said yes. But the memory felt diluted, like a copy of a photograph that had been handled too many times. That night, he lit candles, opened wine, and played our song. He tried. He really did. We sat across from each other, and for the first time in weeks, we talked without phones, without distraction. His voice was softer than I remembered. He told me he missed the way we used to laugh together, that sometimes he felt like we were roommates instead of lovers, and I felt something stir, guilt maybe, or pity. But not the right kind of longing. When he reached for me later, it wasn't forceful or rushed. He was gentle, affectionate, almost reverent. But every part of me froze. My breath shortened, my limbs resisted. Not out of anger, but out of distance. Still, I let him continue. It was mechanical, familiar, and entirely wrong. My body responded because it remembered how to. But nothing inside me moved. I counted the shadows on the ceiling. I focused on the flicker of a candle. I wondered what he would say if he knew that someone else's fingers had already traveled the curve of my waist this week. When it was over, he kissed my cheek and fell asleep quickly, his arm still draped across my stomach like a paperweight. I lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling fan again, just like I had at home. Only now the air felt thinner. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I slipped out from under his arm and padded silently across the room. I didn't turn on any lights, just stepped out onto the small wooden balcony overlooking the inn's parking lot. And then I saw him. Not my husband. Him. The neighbor. Standing near the vending machine just beyond the entrance, a bottle of water in his hand, looking up at the sky like he expected it to answer something for him. Our eyes met. No surprise. In his. Just calm recognition. He raised his bottle in a silent toast. I didn't wave, didn't smile. I just stood there barefoot in my robe, the night air curling around my ankles like cold silk. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about attraction or novelty, it was about presence. He was here, not just physically, but fully. And I wasn't ready for what that meant, but I also wasn't ready to look away. The morning after, everything was too bright. The sun pierced through the old lace curtains like an interrogation lamp, and every object in the room, the half-emptied wine bottle, the crumpled hotel brochure, even the wooden heart on the keyring, felt like evidence. Of what? I wasn't yet sure. But I woke up with the vague sensation that something irreversible had happened, even though my body hadn't moved all night. My husband was still sleeping. One hand splayed awkwardly across the sheets, mouth slightly open. I watched him for a long moment, trying to feel something more than recognition, trying to summon the warmth that used to come so easily, even from just the rhythm of his breathing. But there was only that same dull ache, not sharp enough to scream, not soft enough to ignore. I slipped out of bed and into the hallway barefoot, the old floorboards groaning under my weight. I wasn't dressed to be seen, and I wasn't planning to be. I just needed air, maybe coffee, maybe anything that would pull me out of the heaviness collecting in my ribs. The hallway was empty, and The low hum of vending machines grew louder as I descended the stairs. I wasn't even surprised when I saw him again, leaning casually against the wooden railing just outside the inn, sipping coffee from a paper cup, like it was the most natural thing in the world to be here. At this place. At this moment. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, then down at the cup in his hand. "I didn't follow you," he said, his voice low, calm. "It's a place I used to come to with her, before the diagnosis." I didn't ask who her was. The past hung between us like smoke. I could taste it, but I didn't want to breathe it in too deep. He gestured toward the wooden bench a few steps away, not offering it like a date, more like a peace treaty. I sat. The wood was cold beneath the thin fabric of my robe. I didn't pull it tighter, let the chill work its way across my skin. It helped me stay in my body. We sat like that for a while. Two people who weren't supposed to be having a conversation, doing exactly that. There was a strange comfort in the stillness, in the absence of need to fill every second with words. He didn't ask what I was doing there, and I didn't ask him why it felt like he already knew. Eventually, he turned his head, and the expression on his face wasn't seductive or curious. It was unbearably clear. "I don't want anything." "From you," he said, eyes steady on mine. "I just saw you. That's all." Something about the simplicity of it unnerved me more than a confession would have, because the truth was, I hadn't felt seen in a long time. Not just looked at, not glanced over or checked in on, but really, truly seen. I returned to the room before my husband woke up. I slipped under the covers, not to pretend I'd been there all along, but to delay whatever came next. He stirred, soon after, and smiled like nothing had shifted. Over breakfast, he suggested a hike. "The same trail from last time," he said, biting into toast. "You used to love that lookout." I nodded, and we went. The trail hadn't changed. The incline still started steep, the branches still formed an archway like a cathedral of green, but I had changed. With every step, I felt further from the version of myself who had walked this same path years ago, holding his hand, laughing at nothing, kissing under leaves. Now, my hand remained in my pocket, fingers curled around the room, key I hadn't returned yet. When we reached the lookout, he wrapped his arm around me and pointed toward the valley. "Still just as beautiful," he said. I murmured in agreement, but my gaze didn't follow his finger. It stayed rooted in the present, in the warmth of his arm around my shoulder, and in the stark absence of a reaction within me. It wasn't indifference. It was absence. An emotional vacancy so complete, it left no echo. That night, I dreamed of his hand on mine. Not my husband's, but the neighbor's. Not in passion, not in secrecy. Just resting, steady, present. It woke me in the early hours, heart pounding like I'd just sprinted through a storm, and yet there was no storm. Only stillness. Back home, as we unpacked our bags, I found a stray sock that wasn't mine. Not foreign, just old, stretched out, useless. I stared at it far longer than I should have, until my husband called from the kitchen, asking where I'd put the coffee filters. I answered automatically, but inside, a part of me was already somewhere else. Somewhere quieter, somewhere warmer, somewhere. He had looked at me and said, "I don't want anything from you. I just saw you." And for the first time in years, I had believed him. We returned from the trip late Sunday evening. The lights in our living room felt too sterile, too white, as if the house itself had forgotten how to soften its edges in our absence. I carried my suitcase upstairs and unpacked in silence, placing each item back into its drawer with mechanical precision. Everything smelled faintly of lavender detergent and mountain air, but I already felt it slipping away, like water through cupped hands. My husband was downstairs, putting on one of those Sunday night documentaries he liked. The kind with calm narration and slow music. I knew the pattern well. He would watch for 20 minutes, check his phone, then fall asleep halfway through. Life with him was a series of predictable pauses. Comfortable, but not alive. I went to shower. The water was too hot, and yet I let it burn. As I lathered shampoo into my hair, I found myself thinking about texture, about touch, about skin that felt like bark and breath that stayed close even in silence. I traced a bruise on my thigh I hadn't noticed before, probably from bumping into something at the inn. Or maybe from how tightly I'd curled up in bed those last few nights. When I stepped out, I didn't reach for my usual cotton robe. I opened the bottom drawer instead, the one with the things I used to wear when I wanted to feel wanted. At the back, folded and almost forgotten, was a set of dark coffee-colored lingerie, thin, sheer, and edged with soft lace. I had bought it over a year ago on a whim and never worn it. It wasn't for seduction, it was for me. Or more precisely, for the version of me I missed. I put it on. The mirror didn't lie. I looked present, more present than I had in months. Hair damp and curling at the ends, skin flushed from the heat, silk clinging to my hips like a second thought I wasn't supposed to have. I heard the front door creak open downstairs, and first I thought it was my husband stepping outside to take out the trash or check the porch. But then I remembered. He had said earlier he might fall asleep on the couch if the documentary went late. I moved to the window. There he was, the neighbor, standing near the edge of his porch, gazing up at the night sky like he had on that other night. The distance between us was short, but the quiet made it feel immense. I could hear the crickets, the hum of a distant lawnmower starting one last cycle, and underneath it all, the thudding in my chest. I opened the window just slightly, letting the breeze roll over my skin. I didn't expect him to turn, but he did. And when he saw me, standing there in the soft lamplight, framed by the half-closed curtains, he didn't look away, he didn't smile either, he just watched. We stayed like that for almost a full minute. No movement, no words. Just that ache in the air between us, dense and electric. A suspension. Then he walked away. Not rushed, not hesitant. Just away. I didn't close the window. A few minutes later, I heard a soft knock at the back door. Not the front, the back, hidden from the street, out of sight. My breath caught. For a moment, I did nothing. Then, without fully understanding what I was doing, I walked downstairs, barefoot, each step light but deliberate. I opened the door. He stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning mine like he was checking for hesitation. He didn't cross the threshold. "Do you want me to go?" he asked. His voice was low, careful. I shook my head once. It was the smallest movement, but it was enough. He stepped inside. No one said anything more. Words would have cheapened it. His hand brushed mine as he passed, and I felt my knees weaken, not because I was afraid, but because I was awake. He followed me into the living room, where the only light came from a lamp near the bookshelf. I didn't rush. Neither did he. We sat. We didn't touch. We just were. And in that stillness, I felt my body lean toward his before I even knew it was happening. He met me halfway. His lips found mine in a kiss that wasn't urgent, but full, anchored, in silence, steady and deliberate, like he had all the time in the world and wanted to spend it right there. His hand moved to my jaw, his thumb brushing a strand of damp hair from my cheek. It was such a small gesture, but it broke something. Open in me. Not pain, not guilt, just release. I leaned in deeper, pressing into him with the kind of hunger that doesn't live in the body, but in the memory of touch. My hands found the edge of his shirt. He didn't pull me closer. He let me close the distance on my own. And then we stopped. Not because we had to, but because it wasn't the time. Not yet. I pulled away slowly, chest still rising too fast, hands trembling. He looked at me with a softness I didn't know how to hold. "I should go," he said. I nodded. He stood, but before he reached the door, he turned back. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "But I won't lie. I'll be thinking about that kiss all night." Then he was gone. And I stood in my living room in silence, the taste of his breath still on my lips, the ghost of his fingers still lingering on my skin. I didn't regret it. I just wanted more. The following morning, sunlight spilled across the kitchen tiles like nothing had changed, but everything had. I stood barefoot by the sink, staring at the untouched coffee pot. Normally, by this hour, the house would be filled with the familiar aroma of roasted beans and burnt toast, the morning soundtrack of my marriage. But that day, I couldn't bear to start the routine. It felt like a betrayal, not to my husband, but to myself. He came in around 8, hair still damp from his shower, wearing that navy button-down shirt he always wore on meeting days. He glanced at the empty pot, then at me, eyebrows raised in a quiet question. I mumbled something about not sleeping well. He didn't press. He rarely did. He grabbed his keys and kissed my forehead, the way one might touch a piece of furniture, before leaving the house. A gesture of habit, not desire. Then he was gone and I stood there, still in my robe, holding the edge of the counter like it was the only thing keeping me from dissolving into the tile. The house felt too still once. The door shut behind him, not peaceful, hollow. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe, only amplifies what's already vibrating beneath the skin. I wandered through the rooms like a stranger, touching the back of chairs, trailing fingers across the mantelpiece, unsure of what I was looking for. My phone sat face down on the kitchen table. I hadn't picked it up all morning, afraid that any message, any notification, would anchor me too firmly in one version of reality. Eventually, I walked upstairs and opened my closet. My hands hovered over the same safe pieces, cardigans, jeans, neutral blouses, before brushing past them and choosing something else. A cream-colored sweater dress, softer than it needed to be, and just fitted enough to trace the waist I always pretended not to have. Underneath, I wore nothing. It wasn't for anyone. At least that's what I told myself. But as I walked into the backyard to tend to the flower beds, my gaze drifted, unconsciously, then deliberately, to the neighbor's house. His blinds were partially open. That was new. I felt it before I saw him. The shift in the air, the awareness of another presence tuned precisely to my frequency. He stepped outside moments later, not with intention, not theatrically, just naturally, as if this was his rhythm now too. He was wearing an old Henley shirt, sleeves pushed up, collar slightly undone. His hands were dirty, likely from working in the garden. I admired how effortlessly he belonged to the world around him, how little he seemed to perform. That steadiness made my pulse misbehave. He glanced over, met my eyes, then looked down at the soil in his hand. We didn't speak. But there was an understanding, a stillness that hummed between us like a taut string. Back inside, I tried to distract myself with small chores. Laundry, bills, a half-written grocery list. But my mind was already elsewhere, tracing the edge of last night's kiss like it had been carved into memory. I kept seeing his mouth, his eyes, the way he stood just close enough to feel inevitable, but not invasive. Later that afternoon, I found a folded piece of paper tucked under the potted rosemary on the windowsill by the back door. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't a note in the traditional sense. No full sentences, no name. Just a line from a poem, one I recognized. I have measured out my life with coffee spoons. T.S. Eliot, a line I'd once underlined in college and later forgot. Now it hit differently. It wasn't about routine. It was about wasted potential, about counting the days in teaspoons of nothing. I read it again, then tucked it into the front pocket of my cardigan and didn't tell anyone. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He said work ran over, that the team had ordered in, that he had a headache. All of it felt both true and irrelevant. We ate dinner quietly, the clink of cutlery louder than our conversation. He asked if I was feeling okay. I said yes. What I didn't say. I couldn't stop thinking about a man who had seen me more clearly in 2 kisses than my husband had in 2 years. What I didn't say, I was craving not just the touch, but the attention, the intention, the quiet hum of possibility. That night, I climbed into bed without brushing my hair. I lay on my side, eyes open, waiting for sleep that wouldn't come. My husband lay next to me, scrolling on his phone, the glow from the screen flickering across his face like distant lightning. I turned away from him and stared at the wall. In the dark, I let my fingers drift down my arm, remembering the way his hand had brushed mine the night before. It wasn't about the heat. It was about being wanted quietly, consistently, without demand, and I knew then that I would see him again. Not because I was chasing something forbidden, but because I was finally chasing myself. Sometimes I wonder whether all lives have a moment where the lie becomes too heavy to hold in silence. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that trembles, quietly just beneath the surface, waiting for the smallest shift to split it open. That morning, it happened with something as simple as a change in scent. He was standing in the kitchen, pouring cereal into a bowl like he had every weekday for years. I stood by the counter, wrapping up a leftover croissant when he paused and sniffed the air lightly. "New candle?" he asked without looking at me. I blinked once, thrown by the softness of the question. "No, just opened a window earlier. Maybe something drifted in." He didn't reply. He just chewed slowly, staring down at his bowl. I waited for a second, follow-up, a narrowing of the eyes. But it didn't come. Still, something about the way he placed the spoon down when he finished was different, too controlled. Like he was trying not to press too hard, not to leave a mark. The rest of the morning unfolded without incident, but the silence between us carried weight, like the house had absorbed the tension and was now exhaling it through the walls, creaking in all the places we pretended not to hear. By noon, I found myself pacing near the back window, checking the blinds without meaning to. He was out there again. Of course he was, raking leaves with the same steady movements he used for everything. Methodical, thoughtful, nothing rushed. Nothing chaotic. I stood watching him longer than I should have, one hand pressed to the glass, as if the cold could root me in place. but my body wasn't interested in staying still anymore. Not in this house. Not in this skin that had become too tight around the edges. I told myself I was just going outside to breathe, that the air would clear my thoughts. But I didn't go to the front yard. I took the long way around, toward the side, toward him. He saw me coming but didn't stop what he was doing. That was something I'd come to notice about him. He never interrupted a moment. He let it arrive on its own terms. I stopped a few feet away, folding my arms over my chest, though the afternoon was warm. "I didn't sleep last night," I said. He paused, leaned the rake against a tree. "I didn't expect you to." It wasn't flirtation. There was no arrogance in the words, just a quiet truth, offered without ceremony. "I keep asking myself what I'm doing," I continued, "and I can't decide if I'm waking up or losing my mind." He stepped closer, not too close, just enough to make the space between us feel meaningful. "Maybe both," he said. "Maybe you have to lose a part of yourself to make room for what's real." The wind picked up slightly then, rustling the leaves around our feet, and in that moment I realized how long it had been since someone allowed me to be fully confused without rushing in to solve it. He didn't want to fix me. He just wanted to see me exist. I nodded once, then turned and walked back toward my yard. I didn't look behind me. Later that evening, while preparing dinner, I reached into the back of the drawer for a serving spoon and knocked something loose. It clattered to the floor with a tinny ring, bouncing once before settling near my foot. I bent to pick it up and froze. A small folded piece of paper. I didn't remember placing it there. But the handwriting on the outside was unmistakable. It was my husband's. The ink was dark, the crease precise. I opened it slowly, already feeling my stomach tighten. It was short. "I see the way you look out the window now, and I think I already know. But I don't want to lose you. Not again." There was no signature, no demand, just quiet resignation in ink form. I stood motionless in the kitchen, fingers tightening around the edges of the note. He hadn't asked a question, and that terrified me more than any confrontation could have. That night, we didn't speak about it. We ate dinner in front of the television, some show flickering across the screen that neither of us was really watching. He sat beside me, close enough for his leg to brush mine occasionally, but the contact felt hesitant, like he was asking for permission through touch, not words. I didn't move away, but I didn't lean in either. And when the dishes were done, and the lights were off, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling again. But this time, I didn't think of my neighbor's hands or his lips. I thought about the note, about how it had been written before I even realized he'd noticed, and about how much damage silence could do when it was chosen instead of broken. In the early hours when the sky had only just begun to soften at the edges, I got out of bed, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders, and stepped out onto the back porch. The wood was cold beneath my bare feet, but I didn't care. I needed to see the night one more time before it disappeared. Across the fence, a single light was on in his house. No movement, no figure, just a soft glow in a quiet window. And for the first time since it all began, I didn't want to go to him. I just wanted to be. To exist in the quiet between two worlds, knowing full well I couldn't stay there much longer. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles over a house, when nothing has been said but everything has been understood. Not the aftermath of a fight, not the echo of slammed doors or raised voices, but something quieter, almost clinical. A mutual awareness draped like plastic over furniture, untouched, protective, suffocating. In the days that followed the note, our home turned into a museum of caution. My husband moved with deliberate gentleness, as if afraid that sudden motion might shatter the illusion we both still clung to. He didn't question me, he didn't touch me. But his presence became heavier, like the humidity before a storm. I could feel it in the way he paused longer in doorways, how his eyes lingered on mine a second too long, how his fingers tightened slightly around his coffee mug in the mornings. I began avoiding mirrors, not out of shame, but because they reflected versions of me I didn't know how to reconcile. The woman who shared a bed with her husband, the woman who stood too long by the window, the woman who wore silk beneath her clothes for no one to see. I spent more time outside, watering plants that didn't need it, rearranging already tidy flower beds. Any excuse to feel the sun on my back, to listen to the wind move through the trees instead of the static inside my own mind. He wasn't outside as often now, the neighbor. Whether by instinct or intention, he had retreated. The silence between us was different now, no longer charged, but patient. Not avoidance, but a pause. As if he understood I needed space to choose something without being pulled. One afternoon, while trimming lavender, I found a small box tucked beside the fence where the bushes curved inward. Simple wood, no lock, no note this time. I glanced around before picking it up, my breath catching before I even opened the lid. Inside was a carved figure, no larger than my palm. A woman standing barefoot, spine straight, arms relaxed by her sides. Nothing ornate, just a small, smooth silhouette. The kind of art that's felt more than admired. I closed the box carefully, hands trembling, and tucked it beneath the folds of my sweater. I didn't need a note. I knew what it meant. He had seen me even in stillness, and he had offered something, without taking. That night, my husband made dinner. He stood over the stove in his usual way, quiet, competent, focused. The smell of sautéed onions filled the room. I sat at the kitchen island, watching him, trying to read the shape of his movements like they were a language I used to speak fluently, but had since forgotten. He brought the plates to the table, poured 2 glasses of wine, and sat across from me. For a few minutes, the only sounds were utensils scraping plates and the hum of the refrigerator. Then, in the softest tone, he spoke. "You're not here anymore." It wasn't an accusation. There was no anger, no demand, just fact. I looked up, startled by the clarity of his words, but even more by the steadiness in his eyes. "I don't know where you are," he continued, "but I can feel it, like I'm talking to someone through glass." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came. The words formed in my throat, excuses, confessions, pleas, but I swallowed all of them. He nodded once, as if that silence was confirmation enough. "I'm not asking you to explain," he said. "I just needed to say it, out loud, so I could stop pretending." That night, we slept in the same bed, our backs to each other, but something had changed. The space between us no longer felt like a gap to be closed, but like a decision waiting to be made. The next morning, I didn't make coffee. I dressed slowly, choosing a soft cotton blouse and jeans that fit just right, neither too tight nor too loose. I placed the small wooden figure on my nightstand, where the morning light could find it. Then I left the house. No note, no destination, just motion. I walked until I found a quiet cafe in a neighborhood I rarely visited. I sat near the window with a notebook, one I hadn't touched in years. The pages were blank, expectant. I stared at them for a long time before finally writing a single sentence. "I don't know what I want, but I know I don't want to disappear." I didn't write anything else. On the way home, I passed by the park where I used to jog before life became too tightly scheduled. I stood there for a moment, watching an elderly woman feed crumbs to a line of birds. She looked content, unhurried. She reminded me of the kind of woman I wanted to become, unapologetically in herself. When I returned, the house was empty. My husband had left for work. There was a sticky note on the fridge with a grocery list and the words, "Take your time." I stood in the kitchen, holding the list in one hand, the carved figure in the other, and I realized I didn't need to make a grand decision yet, but I needed to stop standing still. The day he returned, I wasn't expecting him. There'd been no signal, no note, no sound of tools from the yard, just the faint groan of a gate swinging open, the kind of noise the wind might carry if it had memory. I had been reading on the porch, feet tucked beneath me, the carved figure, sitting beside my cup like a silent witness. When I looked up, there he was, standing by the fence with one hand resting lightly on the wood, his gaze calm and impossibly steady. I didn't move. Not out of hesitation, but because something inside me needed to measure the weight of the moment before stepping into it. I had grown careful with silences. I had learned how much truth they could hold. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just nodded once and turned toward his porch. The simplicity of his presence was more jarring than any confrontation would have been. In a world where everything demanded explanation, he offered none, and somehow that gave me permission to breathe again. That afternoon, I didn't avoid the mirror. I stood in front of it for a long time, wrapped in nothing but a towel, hair damp and curling at the ends. I traced the outline of my collarbone, the slope of my shoulders, the stretch marks faintly visible on my hips. I didn't look away. I didn't adjust the light. I didn't pose. Then I opened the drawer where I kept the things I never wore. The dark green slip dress hadn't touched my skin in over a year. It was simple, thin straps, silk that whispered over curves rather than clung. I put it on without jewelry, without perfume, without intent to impress, only to feel, to return to the version of myself who once wore something like this for no one but herself. I crossed the yard barefoot, the grass cool and slightly damp beneath my feet. The gate wasn't locked. It never was. I stepped through, it quietly, each movement deliberate, like I was walking through a memory that still had something left to teach me. He was in the workshop. I knew by the smell of cedar and the warm, hushed light spilling through the small window above the workbench. I didn't knock. I opened the door slowly, and he looked up from whatever he was carving, not startled, not surprised, just aware. Present. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me. He put down his tools and wiped his hands on a cloth. The silence between us, less about absence and more about tension, held delicately, in place, like the pause before the first drop of rain. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," I said quietly. "I never left," he replied. "Not really." I moved closer, the wood beneath my feet creaking softly with each step. The air was warm, filled with the scent of sawdust and something else, something distinctly his. I reached out and ran my fingers along the edge of the workbench, not looking at him directly. "You made her with your hands," I said, nodding toward the carved figure, still tucked into the corner. "But it feels like you made her from my skin." "I made her from watching," he said. His voice wasn't poetic, it wasn't theatrical, it was simple, final, and I felt every word land inside me like pins on fabric being shaped into something that might someday be worn without shame. He didn't reach for me. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured toward the old, worn armchair tucked into the corner of the room. The fabric was faded, the cushions sunken. I sat. He knelt beside me, one hand resting lightly on the arm of the chair, not touching me, just there. "I don't need you to explain anything," he said. "I don't need promises. I don't even need to be needed. But if you want to, be here, for 1 minute or 1 night or nothing at all. I won't look away." The words hit something inside me I hadn't named. I wanted to respond, to say something meaningful, but all that came out was breath. So I leaned forward, not for reassurance, not to be taken, but to meet him. We kissed again. It was slower this time, not tentative, but unhurried. His hands moved to the sides of my face like he was holding something fragile. Not because it might break, but because it had been broken before. The kind of kiss that doesn't demand. It listens. We didn't undress each other. We didn't need to. We just stayed close, pressed together in that narrow room filled with dust and memory and choice. Eventually, I laid my head against his chest. He wrapped his arm around my back, and I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to stay exactly where I was. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow. I didn't know what I would say to my husband, or what decision I would make when the clarity of night gave way to the noise of daylight. But I knew this. I had stepped into the part of my life where I no longer whispered myself into corners. I was choosing presence, and whatever came next, I wouldn't be watching from behind glass.